Welcome to the final part of our lecture today, which is about Weimar Germany 1923 to 1929. And in this part, we're going to look at whether or not this period saw a recovery under the leadership of Gustav Stresemann. So, what do we mean by recovery? Basically, we knew about all of the problems that occurred prior to Stresemann coming in to power, such as the Treaty of Versailles, such as constitutional weaknesses, all of the uprisings and hyperinflation, invasion of the Ruhr, and so on, and also the issue that had come at the very beginning of his reign in terms of the Munich Putsch. So we found that there was a lot of problems in Germany. And many people would argue that Stresemann sorted these problems out during his time in power. So who was he? He was a Chancellor of Germany who took over in 1923 and then became the Foreign Minister of Germany. But he remained the most influential politician of the 1920s. So we need to know his key policies, first of all, and then whether or not they were successful. So here are the main things that he did. He introduced a new currency, which was known as the Rentenmark, which dealt with the problem of hyperinflation. The previous currency we know was worthless, so he basically restarted the economy by creating this new currency. However, he realised he couldn't do this alone, and he had to get the support of other countries. So, one of the things that he did to do this was gaining their trust by signing something called the Locarno Treaty, which said that Germany would not try to take back the lands that they had lost to France during World War I, or at least they'd lost in the Treaty of Versailles. It said of nothing of the land that was lost to Poland. So it really made France a lot more confident in their relationship with Germany. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But it wasn't particularly helpful in boosting Germany's relationship with the countries in the East. The Dawes Plan of 1924 needed American help. And what the Dawes Plan was a plan to reorganise Germany's reparations. So remember, they owed a huge amount of money, $6.6 billion in reparations to countries they'd fought in World War One. And they couldn't afford this, and this was part of what was causing all their problems. So in reorganising them and putting a lower amount to be paid back in the short term meant that they could start paying it back. And that allowed France to feel a bit more satisfied, and then they left the Ruhr. It also, though, attached to this plan was US loan, government loan of 800 million gold marks to the German government, and the opportunity for businesses to borrow from US banks of up to $3,000 million. Okay. Now, that's really, really important because it starts to repair the economy, and we'll talk about the effects of that a little later. Finally is the Young Plan, which is similar to the Dawes Plan in that reparations were altered. They'd be set at a lower rate, so Germany could gradually pay them back over 59 years. And it also attached to this was the idea that France would evacuate the Rhineland by 1930. Again, it was an even bigger step towards making it possible that Germany were going to survive this whole Treaty of Versailles punishment. So were these things successful? In answering this question, it's really helpful to use the acronym PI, and this would be, if I were to write a 12 or a 16 mark question, how I would set my paragraphs up. So let's say you were asked a question, explain why or how Stresemann helped Germany recover in the 1920s. I would do a paragraph on political stability, a paragraph on international relations, and a paragraph on the economy, and explain each one. If I was asked the 16 mark question, which would be an evaluative question, I would do a paragraph suggesting how political stability improved, and then a paragraph suggesting how it didn't. Equally, you can do the same with international relations and the same with the economic recovery. So you see both sides of the argument leading to a conclusion in which the easiest thing to say is that he only improved Germans' situation in the short term, and in the long term, following the Wall Street crash, he really didn't help Germany recover because everything was far too dependent on these American loans, as we'll discuss. So let's start off with what your first paragraph would be, which is about political stability. It is true to say that Germany was much more stable under the leadership of Stresemann. In particular, after 1929, the Social Democrats, the biggest party, joined a coalition with the other parties for the first time since 1923. So they were getting back on track in terms of having cooperative governments where everyone was working together to try and come up with some sort of plan to help Germany improve. Stresemann himself was very popular, and there was very little support for extremist parties, and the evidence to give for that is the 12 seats that the Nazis won in 1928. That's a tiny number of people voting for the Nazis. People tended to vote for the Nazis when they weren't happy with the government that was in charge, so clearly it suggests that people were generally happy with either Stresemann's party or one of the other more moderate kind of democratic parties of the Weimar government. Finally, Hindenburg, who was the president, was maintaining a constitution and allowing the Weimar government to rule without consistently being overruled by Article 48 and emergency decrees and so on. There seemed to be more respect for democracy during this period. Underlying all this, though, clearly there were problems. So the problem of constitution remained. Much of this period there was no majority because of proportional representation. Even in this period, the coalitions were often quite short, so there was kind of a lot of falling out still, and there was never that really strong, stable government that the people of Germany were really looking for. And Hindenburg was still not happy with democracy. So after the Wall Street crash, and then the sort of change in politics that occurs, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, it was obvious that Stresemann hadn't fixed the system. He'd just been keeping it sort of bubbling along whilst the times were good. And when problems occurred, there really wasn't the stability there to keep Germany afloat and keep Germany's recovery to continue in the way that Stresemann would have liked. Secondly, international relations were improving. Okay, this one is a much more kind of like comprehensive and coherent argument that it was successful. So, for example, the ending of the passive resistance in the Ruhr and the Locarno Treaty pleased France and Belgium. These were Germany's traditional allies, and traditional enemies, and they were fearful of invasion. But with Germany and France and Belgium getting on a bit better, the chance of invasion was really decreased. Stresemann was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which is a clear testament to his work. In 1926, Germany was given a seat on the League of Nations, which is a club of countries, a bit like the United Nations is today, where countries support each other, and clearly Germany were no longer seen as a sort of a bad boy at the table who should be told off for his terrible actions in World War I. They were seen as a country that people could do business with, a country that people could communicate fairly and appropriately with. And in 1928, the Germans signed something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which is a promise to keep the army for self-defence only. All countries that joined the pact signed this. It wasn't worth very much because they were at war within 11 years, but in the short term, to promise to only use your army for self-defence really improves your relations with other countries. The only flip side to this argument really is that Poland and Czechoslovakia were still scared of Germany because they weren't included in the Locarno Treaty. So whilst Stresemann was making friends with countries that he needed to, like France, Belgium, USA, he wasn't making friends with the countries in the East. So there was still a little bit of a risk that Germany might end up back at war. Obviously, ultimately, Poland is the first country Hitler does invade after taking bits of Czechoslovakia previously. So, the economic recovery. This is really the most important part of Stresemann, in the Stresemann era. We know they brought in the Rente mark. This stabilised currency, which meant that people could trade again, people could do business again, and the German economy could recover. The Dawes Plan allowed businesses to grow. So what does that actually mean? How does having loans from banks to businesses help the economy? If businesses are able to get loans, they're able to invest in things like factories and employing new workers. And if they do that, then they were able to sell more goods, and their workers are able to buy more goods, and then other businesses open to sell the workers more goods, and you have a continuous positive cycle of economic recovery that can occur. And this really was underway in the 1920s. It also took the pressure off the government, because fewer people are unemployed, then fewer people have to be supported through unemployment benefits. The Young Plan was an extension of this, relieving even more pressure. By 1928, German production, so that's what Germany was producing, finally reached pre-war levels. So it reached the levels that it was before World War One for the first time. So they were really starting to get back on their feet. And exports rose dramatically. So that's products that are being sold to other countries, which is really good for an economy because it brings in foreign currency that they can use. As I sort of alluded to earlier, there was more employment due to the new factories, and new roads, railways and homes were built. So all really positive examples of where Stresemann helped the economy recover. Do really, really revise that. Those are clear bits of evidence you can put into your essay, so do know them. However, a trickier part is to remember the negative side of it. We'll come back to too dependent on US loans in a minute. And let's just have a quick look at the three bottom bullet points. So there was still a serious problem due to rising unemployment. Still a serious problem with unemployment due to a rising population. So whilst they had made some improvements, it wasn't complete. And there was a slight suggestion that growth was slowing, particularly after 1927. And farmers, as we mentioned earlier in this lecture, were a group that weren't doing very well. So it wasn't perfect. But the really, really important thing, and the thing that will probably link into your conclusion and your kind of thrust of your argument if you're doing a 16-mark question on this, is that as with much of what Stresemann had done to help Germany recover, it was far too dependent on the loans and the support that the USA was giving it. Now, this was made all too clear in 1929 when the Wall Street crash happened and the USA asked for their loans back. Stresemann himself said that they were, quote, dancing on a volcano, end quotes. So he knew that they were far too dependent on US loans, and prior to his death in 1929, he was starting to feel that that might be a really big risk. And clearly, as we'll look at in the next lecture, where we look at why people started to vote for the Nazis and how Hitler came to power, this really, really was a big, big problem. Because as soon as the US withdraw their loans, the economy comes tumbling down, and like a house of cards, the political stability does the same, with the Nazis and communists attracting more support, and then ultimately relations with other countries decline once the Nazis are in power. And start going back on everything that Stresemann and the Treaty of Versailles had said as a way of increasing positive relations with other countries. So your conclusion to this argument should be that yes, Stresemann made short-term improvements to the stability of Germany and helped it recover during the period that he was in power. But in the long term, these improvements were not fully successful because they were far too dependent on US loans.